Hello, everybody. I'm Jeffrey, and this is AutoAlchemy, the intersection between typology and self-growth. And today, I'm going to be reading through a passage or two from Psychological Types by Carl Jung. So, one thing that I'm interested in doing on my channel and in general is attempting to reconcile modern understandings of typology with the original writing of Carl Jung. I think that he was a very brilliant person, although clearly flawed in some respects. And one of my concerns in the last couple of years has been that typology, a lot of typology that I see is really detached from his original observations to the point that it seems like people aren't even talking about the same thing. They're not even using the same starting point. And so I feel like there's a little bit of this castles in the air phenomenon where people are grabbing language and then, pretending as if that language is somehow valid, even though they're taking everything completely out of context, yada, yada, yada. In any case, my point is, I am hoping that I'm not making any promises here, but I'm interested in reading through this entire book and doing some longer sessions where I'm just reading and talking out my thoughts, trying to show a very unedited process of me attempting to digest the information. And then hopefully I can also create some distillations of that process. So this is going to be the first pass, a rough draft, and then I think maybe I will, if I've sufficiently digested the material, then I might create a more condensed summary of, if not chapters of the book, then relevant sections. So I'll compress those into maybe a 10-minute YouTube video or a series of videos. Whatever the case may be, I'm spitballing at this particular point in time because I don't know. So why don't we just start reading Psychological Types. Plato and Aristotle. These are not merely two systems. They are types of two distinct human natures, which from time immemorial, under every sort of disguise, stand more or less inimically opposed. The whole medieval world in particular was riven by this conflict, which persists down to the present day and which forms the most essential content of the history of the Christian Church. Although under other names, it is always of Plato and Aristotle that we speak. Visionary, mystical, Platonic natures disclose Christian ideas and the corresponding symbols from the fathomless depths of their souls. Practical, orderly, Aristotelian natures build out these ideas and symbols out of these ideas and symbols a fixed system, a dogma, a cult. Finally, the church embraces both natures, one of them entrenched in the clergy and the other in monasticism, but both keeping up a constant feud. So, already, this is a book that is allegedly about psychological types, and this quotation that opens the book is highlighting two distinct ways of seeing the world, ways that go back to Aristotle and Plato. Now, this isn't Jung himself saying that, he's quoting from another author, I guess. But I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, and to put it succinctly, we often think of Socrates as being the father of modern philosophy, and Plato was his student, and then Aristotle was his student. And in this process of transmitting information from teacher to student, some philosophical changes inevitably got in the way, and little factions were created. And what this quote is saying to me, it makes me think of the archetypes and this notion that everything that's transpiring on the world stage is really an ancient conflict or an ancient series of conflicts that are just dressed up in new clothing. So especially in this particular case, it seems to be indicating that a lot of philosophical dispute boils down to the same dispute that was had between Plato and Aristotle. Again, it's something that continually crops up over time, and I'm assuming that Jung would say that these ideas will continue to play out into the future. I don't know, maybe they can be reconciled, but it does seem like we're sort of caught in this carousel. I know that St. Thomas of Aquinas is somebody who picked up the Aristotelian banner later in life, or not later in life, but later in history. And there were Neoplatonists and the Christian church. And so, yeah, these ideas from the past even shaped the foundation of Christianity, the ideological disputes within Christianity, persisting to this present day. I do wonder because Psychological Types, I believe, was written 100 years ago, so it makes me wonder what more modern manifestations of these particular conflicts would look like. And then we get an idea of what this distinction is pointing at. So the Aristotelian worldview seems to be practical, orderly, dogmatic, whereas the Platonic worldview is visionary, mystical. It seems somehow soul-oriented. And interestingly, the final line here is about how the church embraces both natures, making a space for both of these different energies. So I kind of like that because there's this greater structure that is trying to somehow contain these conflicting oppositions, and I think that's a very Jungian idea. I'm sure that we'll see more about that as time goes on. I do wish I remembered a bit more about Plato versus Aristotle. I remember actually when I was a philosophy major, I was drawn a little more to Aristotle's approach. I think primarily because I was very influenced by Ayn Rand at that point in time, for better or worse. And Aristotle is a philosopher, one of the few philosophers, honestly, that she thinks is worth talking about. Well, positively. She had a lot to say about some people, most other philosophers, honestly. But she would then crap on them. So anyway, on to the introduction. In my practical medical work with nervous patients, I have long been struck by the fact that besides many individual differences, there are also typical differences. Two types especially become clear to me. I have termed them the introverted and extroverted types. So people have their own texture, their own character, talking to a bunch of fools, but then you think, hang on a second, I've seen this particular pattern before. Why is it that people keep behaving as if they're caricatures, as if they're stereotypes? I hope you guys can't hear that. It's inevitable that you actually are hearing it, but oh well. When we consider the course of human life, we see how the fate of one individual is determined more by the objects of his interest, while in another it is determined more by his own inner self, by the subject. So, subject versus object, introvert, extrovert. Since we all swerve rather more towards one side or the other, we naturally tend to understand everything in terms of our own type. This is an interesting concept that I've thought about. Oh, somebody's mowing, if you can't tell. Oh, and they're riding around in one of the riding mowers, so hopefully they'll make quick work of it. I believe Jung thought that essentially everything that we do is in some respect autobiographical, and he says we naturally tend to understand everything in terms of our own type, and I think that's a very spot-on observation. I think we've all had conflicts with other people where where the conflict is really arising from us making the assumption that the other person is going to process reality the same way that we are, and that they are going to come to the same kind of conclusion that we are. I didn't I didn't want to harass you because I wouldn't want to be harassed. I didn't offer I don't know. I won't give an example. I have some examples in mind, but I don't want to get into them. All right, onward. I mention this circumstance at once in order to avoid possible misunderstandings. It will be apparent that it is one which considerably aggravates the difficulty of a general description of types. So, because we all want to understand things in terms of our own type, it's sort of difficult to do a general description. Jung talks about himself as an introvert, and his this particular model that we're looking at, the model of psychological types, is in some respect a very introverted, subject-oriented model of the psyche. What I mean by that is that it's saying that the actions and the behaviors and the attitudes that people have are reflective rather of some sort of internal tendency moving outward. Because I have this particular configuration of cognitive functions, I therefore approach the world. So we're beginning with the subject and moving towards the object. Other psychological theorists who might be more extroverted in this particular sense of the term may see a person's behavior as being entirely motivated by some sort of external good. So I can't even think of a good example. I know that some psychologists would say that your character or your behavior is all, in some respect, validation seeking, or an attempt to impress the object, maybe get the attention of the mother, the father, or people who therefore, or who in time become representatives of or carriers of those particular images in the psyche. I must presume unduly upon the goodwill of the reader if I may hope to be rightly understood. It would be relatively simple if every reader knew to which category he belonged, but it is often very difficult to find out whether a person belongs to one type or the other, especially in regard to oneself. In respect of one's own personality, one's judgment as a rule is extraordinarily clouded. This subjective clouding of judgment is particularly common because in every pronounced type, there's a special tendency to compensate the one-sidedness of that type. A tendency which is biologically purposive since it strives constantly to maintain the psychic equilibrium. This compensation gives rise to secondary characteristics or secondary types, which present a picture that is extremely difficult to interpret, so difficult that one is inclined to deny the existence of types altogether and to believe only in individual differences. So, I like this passage because as somebody who's interested in the objective personality system, this is an insight that they really like to emphasize, and it's not something that I hear from many other approaches to typology. Maybe it's implicit in some of them, but it's never explicitly stated to this degree. Now, I'm not looking deeply into every other approach to typology, but I'm just speaking from my experience currently. Willing to be corrected. But, okay, what else? So it's difficult to tell if you belong to one type or the other, especially if we're talking about you damn crazy. So your judgment's clouded, and then additionally, you might not think, so if you're highly extroverted, if you have an extreme amount of one-sidedness, if you're highly oriented towards the object, there is going to be some sort of compensating mechanism within the psyche, and that plays a role in trying to make sure that you don't get too far off balance. So I think of this in relationship to the idea of swings, savior demon swings, again in the objective personality system. That's the idea that, okay, so I've been going so all in on pleasing the tribe, pleasing the people around me, and now I'm just fed up. Now I'm fed up with serving the object, and I'm going to have this very temporary blip where I binge and I overindulge in doing something for myself. Maybe I even make a big show about finally doing something for myself. I'm standing up for myself. I'm going to do what I want, and I don't give a damn what anybody says. And that is, yeah, that's that's what I mean by the compensation. It's like a moment where the psyche is pulling the handbrake and trying to course correct. I must emphasize this difficulty in order to justify certain peculiarities in my presentation. It might seem as if the simplest way would be would be to describe two concrete cases and dissect them side by side, but everybody possesses both mechanisms, extroversion as well as introversion, and only the relative predominance of one or the other determines the type. So it's probably important here to mention that, or to reiterate if people are getting lost or confused, that when he's saying the word type, he is particularly talking about the introverted type and the extroverted type. He considers these as broad categories. Hence, in order to throw the picture into the necessary relief, one would have to retouch it rather vigorously, and this would amount to a more or less pious fraud. So he's saying there that if you wanted to do cases side by side, the only way to really show the contrast between the two would be to ignore the fact that everybody possesses both mechanisms, and therefore it would involve lying in some respect, doing a bit of forgery, fudging the details. Moreover, the psychological reactions of a human being are so complicated that my powers of description would hardly suffice to draw an absolutely correct picture. There are many things in life that are hard to articulate. There are energetic exchanges between people, and those can be informative when it comes to understanding someone's psychology, but they're hard to compress into language. We are more than just linguistic beings existing from the neck up. From sheer necessity, therefore, I must confine myself to a presentation of principles which I have abstracted from a wealth of facts observed in many different individuals. In this, there is no question of a deductio a priori, as it might appear. It is rather a deductive presentation of empirically gained insights. These insights will, I hope, help to clarify a dilemma which not only in analytical psychology but in other branches of science as well, and especially in the personal relations of human beings with one another, has led and still continues to lead to misunderstanding and discord. So, he's going to present some abstract principles abstracted from a wealth of facts. And he's saying that this is not me starting with principles that I am then deducting or forcing the facts to fit. He's just trying to emphasize here that he's a clinician and that these are insights that have been gained from practical experience with other people. I think elsewhere in the book, he'll say something about how he originally believed that introversion was the exact same thing as thinking, and that feeling was the same thing as extroversion. That is, if you think about it, a reflection of his own psyche. But as he worked with more people and as he tried to treat that principle as a guiding star, he found that it wasn't that helpful, and that you could then further differentiate these concepts. And then we have introverted feelers and extroverted thinkers as a result of that. He's also hoping that these insights, the insights about there being different psychological types, will serve science, but also human beings more broadly. Because failing to understand these facts about our psychology leads to discord, leads to tension. For they explain how the existence of two distinct types is a fact that has actually been long known, a fact that in one form or another has struck the observer of human nature or dawned upon the brooding reflection of the thinker, presenting itself to Goethe, I think that's how you say his name, Goethe's intuition, for instance, as the all-embracing principle of systole and diastole. Let's look that up and make sure we're saying it right. Wow, I did say systole, right? And then I'm going to guess that I said diastole. Yep, all right. These names and concepts by which the mechanisms of introversion or extroversion and introversion have been grasped are extremely varied, and each of them is adapted to the standpoint of the observer in question. So essentially, these ideas have been discussed before, although we have encountered them under different names. Maybe we could do a little throwback here to the Aristotle versus Plato debate. Maybe Aristotle was more of an extrovert and the mystical Plato was more introverted. Maybe so. That's one interesting thing about this book. It feels like very little of the book is actually about the types as we know them. So much goes into discussing the distinction between introversion and extroversion and sort of tracing the history of conceptual understanding of that distinction. The names and concepts by which the mechanisms, I read that. But despite the diversity of formulations, the fundamental idea common to them all shines through. In one case, an outward movement of interest towards the object, extroversion, and in the other, a movement of interest away from the object to the subject and his own psychological processes. In the first case, the object works like a magnet upon the tendencies of the subject. It determines the subject to a large extent and even alienates him from himself. His qualities may become so transformed by the assimilation to the object that one might think it possessed some higher and decisive significance from him. It might almost seem as if it were an absolute determinant, a special purpose of life or fate that he should wholly abandon himself to the object. But in the second case, the subject is and remains the center of every interest. It looks, one might say, as though all of the life energy were ultimately seeking the subject and thus continually prevented the object from exercising an overpowering influence. It is as though the energy were flowing away from the object and the subject were a magnet drawing the object to itself. I find this language about the subject versus the object a little difficult to wrap my head around. I think because I know typology and because I understand more or less what he's getting at by introversion versus extroversion, that gives me a little bit of a leg up, but at the same time, the language feels a little clinical, perhaps, and I think some examples in this case would have been much appreciated. One thing that is worth mentioning here is that when Jung is talking about the object, it's very easy to think of something like a phone, like a person becomes so fixated on their greasy, reflective phone that somehow their subjective factor is becoming so repressed that they become alienated from themselves. I'm not sure if that's exactly what he means. I think the way he writes about the object in this book, it seems to be primarily the case that he's referring to the object as other people, although I do think that it can be abstracted into something more like an object. Somebody who becomes so fixated on money, perhaps. I don't know if that's a good example. I was hoping that the maestro himself would provide more examples. um, but the concept of the magnet is somewhat helpful. So the introvert is pulling things towards himself, and the extrovert is getting pulled, getting yanked out into the world. All right, so it is not easy to give a clear and intelligible description of this two-way relationship to the object without running the risk of paradoxical formulations, which would create more confusion than clarity. But in general, one could say that the introverted standpoint is one which sets the ego and subjective psychological process above the object and the objective process, or at any rate seeks to hold its ground against the object. This attitude, therefore, gives the subject a higher value than the object, and the object accordingly has a lower value. It is of secondary importance. Indeed, sometimes the object represents no more than an outward token of a subjective content, the embodiment of an idea, the idea being the essential thing. If it is the embodiment of a feeling, then again, the feeling is the main thing, and not the object in its own right. The extroverted standpoint, on the contrary, subordinates the subject to the object, so that the object has a higher value. In this case, the subject is of secondary importance, the subjective process appearing at times as no more than a disturbing or superfluous appendage of objective events. It is clear that the psychology resulting from these contrary standpoints must be classed as two totally different orientations. The one sees everything in terms of his own situation, the other in terms of the objective event. Whenever I was reading about the more subjective, introverted psychological process, holding its own or holding its ground against the object, I thought of an introverted person being at a concert, and at concerts, there's obviously a lot of energy. People get swept up in this dynamic that is greater than any single person, and in some ways, people become a conduit of that energy, a channel for that energy. They let some of their subjectivity recede, and maybe a more introverted person at a concert might witness that process and want to step back from it in some respect, not get drawn in and lose themselves in this collective experience. It would, if they don't like the music, maybe that will be much easier for them, or maybe their psychological slant will make it easier for them by default. I don't know, but the ultimately the image I had in my head is of like some snooty person witnessing a concert and kind of turning their nose up and being like, wow, look at all of these fools. Like, they clearly don't have the introverted understanding that I have, or they don't have the internal logic to realize that all of this stuff is meaningless, all of this sound and fury and yada, yada, yada. Just someone who's very dismissive of the thing that's happening objectively around them. They're not participating in the process as it wants to be participated in, as it's almost like this storm that is like collecting everyone around it and forcing them into a pattern. So that's the introverted imagery that I had. And then the extrovert imagery that I had was maybe of somebody who goes to their church and they participate in the songs and the dancing, and maybe they do a little speaking in tongues if that's the kind of church that they're in. And yet there's like a little voice inside them that's like, man, this is kind of stupid. But ultimately, that voice is so quiet in the face of their tendency to just surrender to the objective influence, the influence of the object, the outer other people, and the situation that they happen to be in. Yes, the objective event. Oh, don't like that. These contrary attitudes are in themselves no more than correlative mechanisms. The diastolic going out and seizing of the object, and a systolic concentration and detachment of energy from the object seized. Every human being possesses both mechanisms as an expression of his natural life rhythm, a rhythm which Goethe, surely not by chance, described physiologically in terms of the heart's activity. A rhythmical alternation of both forms of psychic activity would perhaps correspond to the normal course of life. So we need a little introversion, a little extroversion, little introversion, little extroversion. But the complicated outer conditions under which we live and the even more complicated conditions of our individual psychic makeup seldom permit a completely undisturbed flow of psychic energy. So there are things that get in the way. Maybe we develop a complex about something. We develop a lot of baggage around something, and we don't want to go within, and we don't want to explore the darkness that's building up there. We don't want to look at the plaque on our teeth. We don't want to open that mouth. Outer circumstance and inner disposition frequently favor one mechanism and restrict or hinder the other. Okay? Do those ever come into conflict? That's a question that's occurring to me right now. One mechanism will naturally predominate, and if this condition becomes in any way chronic, a type will be produced. That is, an habitual attitude in which one mechanism predominates permanently, although the other can never be completely suppressed, since it is an integral part of the psychic economy. Hence, there can never be a pure type in the sense that it possesses only one mechanism with the complete atrophy of the other. A typical attitude always means merely the relative predominance of one mechanism. And I think elsewhere in here he talks about that predominance as having a degree of automaticity. So it's the classic example is somebody throws you a ball and you go with your dominant hand. Right, we're getting to the end of this introduction. The hypothesis of introversion and extroversion allows us, first of all, to distinguish two large groups of psychological individuals. Yet this grouping is of such a superficial and general nature that it permits no more than this very general distinction. Closer investigation of the individual psychologies that fall into one group or the other will at once show great differences between individuals who nevertheless belong to the same group. So you can start comparing extroverts and be like, hey, this extrovert's nothing like that extrovert. What's the deal? What are these other factors? Are they individual differences, or are there other psychological, typological considerations? Only time will tell, but if you're here, you kind of know the answer already. If, therefore, we wish to determine wherein lie the differences between individuals belonging to a definite group, we must take a further step. Experience has taught me that, in general, individuals can be distinguished not only according to the broad distinction between introversion and extroversion, but also according to their basic psychological functions. For in the same measure as outer circumstances and inner disposition cause either introversion or extroversion to predominate, they also favor the predominance of one definite basic function in the individual. I have found from experience that the basic psychological functions, that is, functions which are genuinely as well as essentially different from the other functions, prove to be thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Finally, we get to the cognitive functions that we all know and love. I was actually a bit surprised that they're mentioned this early. I have, as I said before, I've read this before, but it's all a bit fuzzy, and I thought these were coming way later. If one of these functions habitually predominates, a corresponding type results. I therefore distinguish a thinking, feeling, a sensation, and an intuitive type. Each of these types may, moreover, be either introverted or extroverted, depending on its relation to the object, as we have described above. In my preliminary work on psychological types, I did not carry out this differentiation, but identified the thinking type with the introvert and the feeling type with the extrovert, as I mentioned before. A deeper study of the problem has shown this equation to be untenable. In order to avoid misunderstandings, I would ask the reader to bear in mind the differentiation that I have developed here. For the sake of clarity, which is essential in such complicated matters, I have devoted the last chapter of this book to the definitions of my psychological concepts. All right, so that was the introduction to psychological types. What can we say in summary about this introduction? We can say that Jung is very concerned with weaving the narrative. It may be true, but it's also a narrative, that these insights are derived from his empirical work, his clinical work with real human beings. As I said before, what was the exact language? A deeper study of the problem has shown this equation to be untenable. Well, that's not exactly what I thought he said, but yeah, essentially he's saying that these empirically gained insights have been refined and revised with time to actually be helpful to the nervous patients that he's working with. We're starting with the broad differences of introversion and extroversion. So people have individual differences, but there are also typical differences. So people clearly have individual differences. I was born in this town. You were born in that town. I come from a family of cobblers. You come from a family of venture capitalists. Yes, both exist in the same world. People have their individual differences, their individual preferences. You like this band, I like this band. But if you zoom out a little bit, there are also typical differences. You can see clustering, you can see categories. Jung seems to think that one of the clearest categories is the introversion versus extroversion category. Again, the introvert is repressing the objective factor and drawing things in towards the ego or towards the subject. The extroverted types are getting pulled out towards the object and sort of losing sight of the interior experience. He also emphasizes that it's difficult to know what category you belong to, and the category you belong to informs the way that you interpret or even describe the types. So that's a very challenging feature of making a work like this. Additionally, we all have all mechanisms to some degree. If I am too extroverted, then there's going to be an introverted part of me that is hankering to get out and fight for its life. He's also emphasizing that these ideas have been around for a long time. We've seen them by many different names. Goethe, Goethe. Goethe. Wow, that's neurotic. These ideas have been around and discussed by other thinkers, and perhaps because they keep cropping up time and time again, that just is a testament to their existence. Forget the words we're using. We're going to talk about introversion versus extroversion, but hey, you could talk about Platonic versus Aristotelian. And one mechanism, life is very rarely a completely balanced thing. Typically, with the complicated conditions of our lives, some mechanism is dominating and another is being hindered or restricted. And if this becomes chronic, a type will be produced. So basically, a person continually moves towards one mode of action while repressing its opposite. But we can look at the extroverts and the introverts and see, even within those categories, that there are differences. And one of the basic differences that we can see between all of the extroverts is that they also develop or latch onto a function of the psyche, thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition. So Jung's thinking about this a little differently than modern people do, modern typological fanatics do. He's treating the introverted or extroverted mechanism as a separate thing from the function, even if they can kind of wire together and fire together. And these ideas are being differentiated, further refined, and I think we see some further refinement in the objective personality system. If you want more on my thoughts about differentiation of these ideas, you should check out my video, Complexifying the Functions, a response to Eric Thor. And in any case, that is going to be it for now. That was the introduction to psychological types. I hope this video was informative for you somehow. Wabam! All right, thank you for tuning in. I will catch you next time.